It's been an anthem ever since it was released in 1984. It has been used in countless movies and television shows such as Glee and He-Man, Masters of the Universe, and Loki and Euphoria, even Shrek 2. It was featured on a Doritos commercial. It was featured on an Aldi commercial. You'll hear it even on a car dealership commercial that's down in the cities even right now. Perhaps it's most known for the scene of the movie in which it originated, the great show of Footloose, when Kevin Bacon is ready to square off against his arch enemy in a game of chicken on tractors, and they both have bucket loaders on their tractors, and they're going to go head to head, and whoever chickens out first is the loser, and of course the enemy bolts over at just the last minute, and he falls into the ravine, and Kevin Bacon is the hero of the scene. And of course, I'm talking about the hit song "Holding Out for a Hero" by Welsh singer Bonnie Tyler. We all know this song, along with its catchy melody and its lyrics. It speaks universally to anyone who has ever needed help, only to have no respite. In the first verse, she asks the questions: where have all the good men gone, and where are all the gods? Where's the streetwise Hercules to fight the rising odds? Isn't there a white knight upon a fiery steed? Late at night I toss and I turn and I dream of what I need. And if there was a soundtrack now to 1 Samuel chapter 17, the top track in that soundtrack would be Bonnie Tyler's song, "I'm Holding Out for a Hero." The Israelites are once again going out to battle against their arch enemies, the Philistines, and they initially go out enthusiastically, drawing the battle lines up since just a few chapters earlier. They defeated the Philistines handily under the new leadership of their king Saul. Assuming that this would be a repeat, they come to the valley of Elah just as they did the first time, which was without any weapons. And since the Philistines controlled all the blacksmithing and all the metals in the area, they didn't have weapons, and the only people that did have any battle gear was the king and the crown prince Jonathan. Regardless, as long as they have King Saul, everything is as it should be. Until the Philistines' great weapon walks out. And out of the ranks of their army, his name is Goliath of Gath. He's a giant of a man. He's armed with the best military technology of the day, and he immediately takes charge of the situation and says, "Hey, Israel, this can all be over. This can be over quickly. Just send out your best warrior to fight me. If you win, we will be slaves of all of you. If I win, then we will be slaves to you. What do you say?" And the Israelites, who were so confident approaching the battle lines a few minutes ago, now all have their tails between their legs. They look to their king, who was appointed for just such a time as this. And he is just as scared as they are. So here's this powerful Israelite army, and every one of them is singing, "I need a hero. I'm holding out for a hero till the end of the night. He's got to be strong. He's got to be fast. He's got to be fresh from the fight. I'm holding out for a hero till the end of the night. He's got to be sure. He's got to be soon. And he's got to be larger than life." This morning we take a look at one of the most famous accounts in all of Scripture, the story of David and Goliath, and it's a tall order. It's almost 60 verses long, and the temptation is to apply it all allegorically. The traditional understanding and evangelical way of interpreting this is looking at it completely allegorically. You are David, and if you just run at your giants, and you will defeat them. The sling and the stone that you have is your faith, and by faith you can take down whatever giants come your way. Why hold out for a hero when the hero that you need is the one that you see right in front of you in the mirror? Well, I want to propose to you today that perhaps we've been viewing this passage wrongly. What if we aren't supposed to see ourselves as David? What if we are supposed to see ourselves rather on the battle lines with our tails between our legs and holding out for a hero? What if we are meant to be the king who abdicated our responsibility and instead want someone else to do the job that we were hired for? Today, as we look at this familiar story, we're going to find out that there is a hero that the story is pointing to, and it is a hero that is far better, far greater, far more mighty, and far more glorious than we could ever hope for. We are holding out for a hero, and we find him in the person and work of Jesus. And so there are two things that we need to see from this passage today. And the first is that we need to see our giant problems through God's eyes. We need to see our giant problems through God's eyes. The previous chapter, the one that we have just exited from last week, is dominated by the idea that God sees things differently. He views things differently. He has a will and a desire that is different than ours. Samuel was sent by God to Bethlehem to anoint the king that God had chosen. And immediately Samuel falls into the same trap that Israel did when Saul was presented to Israel as their king. If you remember back in chapter 9, it describes Saul like this. It says that he was a handsome man. There was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people. And so when you looked at Saul, you thought, man, this guy, this is the part right here, man. This is the king. This is the one that looks like the hero that we desperately need. And so when Samuel now goes to the house of Jesse to anoint the next king, he thought the same of Eliab, who was the oldest. Notice what it says here in chapter 16, verse 6. When they came, he looked on Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. And God immediately corrects his understanding by saying, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. For the Lord sees, man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. And so when David is presented in chapter 16, it's clear that his exterior does not fit the ideal. And it's a lesson that we've had to learn thus far, that it really doesn't matter what a person looks like. It really doesn't matter their pedigree. It doesn't matter their educational background. It doesn't matter their vocational experience. What matters is what is in God's heart and who he plans to accomplish his purposes through. God sees differently. And so when we approach chapter 17, we're once again confronted with our propensity to judge by the exteriors. Whether we get pumped up about what a king looks like, or we cower in fear of a threat, we are creatures that trust our own eyes to size up the situation. And it makes sense when you consider the behemoth that has walked out of the Philistine army. Look at how he is described here in verse 4. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. Don't get too hung up on that word champion. It literally means man in the middle. So he's the man in between the two armies. But what we should see here is his size. And I don't know if you've looked at your what do they call it, currency translator of what a cubit is compared to us, because we don't use cubits very much as a measuring device. But it would appear that this man is roughly 9 foot 9 inches tall. That's huge. And before you think this is some fairy tale, it might be helpful to know that archaeologists in the Middle East have found skeletons that were over 9 feet. And it might be helpful to know that archaeologists have also discovered Egyptian letters from the 13th century that mention Canaanite warriors that are from 7 to 9 feet tall. So this description here is very believable. When you consider the average height of a Hebrew man was between 5 foot nothing and 5'5", you can imagine how intimidating a 9'9" man would be. But he wasn't out there empty-handed. Look in verse 5. He had a helmet of bronze on his head. He was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of his coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung in between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer went before him. Now, again, we don't have measurements like this before, but if we were to total up all of that, he is, on his body, has 125 pounds worth of armor. That's a lot of armor. So here he is, he's tall, he's strong, and he's fortified. That would be terrifying. And there's a subtle description of this Goliath here that gets lost in the English. We typically know what a coat of mail is, but in the Hebrew, the word for mail is the word scale. And what we mean by scale is not a weight, but it's like fish scales. And so here's a man that comes out here in this suit of armor that looks like scales, but it's not like a fish. It's more like a serpent. And so here he is coming out there, putting on the full embodiment of the serpent of Israel's arch enemy all the way back from the Garden of Eden. The serpent himself, the devil. It's not saying he was, but he certainly shows a figure of it. Now, who in their right mind would want to take on this man in a one-on-one fight to the death? Not me. I'd have been on the sides too. I would have been cowering in fear. In fact, I may not have even been on the sides. I may have made like Snagglepuss and exit stage left, and I would have gotten out of there. The text tells us that this went on for 40 days. 40 days, can you imagine that? After a week, you'd know that no one's going to step up to this guy. This is a giant problem. And the problem seems to grow when David shows up. He wasn't old enough yet to fight in the Israelite army. And so his dad sends him on a regular mission to bring sandwiches to his brothers and food to the officers as just sort of a help and an encouragement as they fight this battle. And also to bring news from the battlefront as well back to his dad who was farming. On this particular voyage, however, when David comes to the Israelite camp, he not only uses his spiritual eyes, but notice he uses his spiritual hearing as well. Verse 23, and as he talked with them, behold, the champion, Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before. Now, what were those words? Verse 8 through 10 tell us that he stood out and he shouted to the ranks of Israel, why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we can fight together. And after 40 days, the Israelites have tuned him out. But in verse 23 it says, David heard him. Just like we hear the phone ringing. Whereas everyone else is cowering, David is incensed, and he exhales godly anger. In verse 26, he says, who is this uncircumcised Philistine, which was a derogatory term, that he should defy the armies of the living God? And it's here that we see a second giant problem. David goes up to his brothers, and his brother is annoyed with him. Look what it says. It says, why have you come down? This is Eliab talking to David. And with whom have you left the few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. And David, like any other little brother ever in the history of the world, says to his brother, "What have I done now? What this time?" Remember that Eliab is rather tall and foreboding looking. So in David's eyes, there's a giant in the valley, and there's a giant in his family. And now his words would reach another giant, King Saul. And it's pretty obvious that Saul, he calls David in to basically shut him up. But notice David's boldness as he approaches this new giant in Saul in verse 32. David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight the Philistine." Now, teenagers, this is not an insult to you. It's proper part of maturation. But teenagers in general today are no different than back then. They often tend to be quite zealous and presumptuous and have a feeling of being invincible. And so they say and do things that maybe they don't quite know what they're getting themselves into. Totally understandable here. And Saul recognizes that. And in verse 33, he says, "You're not able to go against the Philistines to fight with them, for you're but a youth, and he's been a man of war since his youth." Okay, so totally understandable response from Saul, right? I mean, think about this. A lot is riding on this. If David loses, Saul not only loses his crown, if he survives, he is in bondage for the rest of his life. He is a slave to people that hate him. And if David loses, it's not just Saul. The entire nation becomes servants of the Philistines. So this affects generations. But again, Saul is demonstrating what it means to live by sight. David actually convinces Saul now that he's up to the task in verse 34. Look what it says. It says, "Look, in my time," he basically says, "Look, as a shepherd, I faced bears, I faced lions that have come and tried to take away my sheep. Every time that's happened, I've killed them all. I grab them by the beard and I would take them out. And if I can take care of lions and bears, then surely this uncircumcised Philistine should be no problem for the Lord if he should want me to use me." So Saul agrees, but there's still a lack of vision. Instead of taking him at his word and saying, "All right, David, go get it," he says, "You should use my armor." And all Saul saw was that it had to be done his way. He sees the battle through his own eyes, through his own means, and his own plan. And so David puts on this outfit of Saul. Remember, Saul is the tallest man in all of Israel. And David's just a teenager at this point. And so not only has he not had experience in this battle gear, but it doesn't fit. And so he says, no, I'm not going to use this. There's no point in me doing this. If the Lord is God, then armor or not, God's going to do what God's going to do. So take note here of the position of David. Two giants in his life have written him off. Eliab says, "You're a pain." King Saul says, you're inexperienced. And now this third giant, Goliath, says, "You're puny." And in a few moments, all these giants will be slain by David in a sense. And so this is all because David is anointed with the Spirit and he sees things differently. David's got 99 problems right now, but God ain't one of them. In fact, he sees God as the only solution. As David would say in verse 47, "All this assembly may know that the Lord saves, not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." Clearly, this shows us that we need to refocus our vision. Not to the things of this world, but on the things of God. We should stop shaking in fear in the shadows of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. We need to plug our ears against the chatter and the noise of dissenters. We need to stop looking at the world's solutions and the world's weapons. And we need to do this not because we should be Davids, but because David pointed to the one who truly had God's perspective in everything that he did. When Jesus ministered on earth, he met adversaries all the time. He was despised and rejected. He was full of sorrows. He was acquainted with grief. He had enemies on every side, yet the will of the Lord was his vision. And unlike David, Jesus' victory came through loss. It was through his suffering, and it was through his death that he was able to meet the greatest foe of all, the greatest giant, sin and death, and win. And because he did that, he was the hero. And you and I, standing on the battle lines, shaking in fear, have victory too in him. Friends, we have giant problems, but praise the Lord that in Christ we have a giant slayer. And we look to him and him alone for our victory. And that leads us right into our second point here, is that we need to look to the true hero. There is a true hero in this passage. Again, picture the scene. On one side of the valley, you have the Philistines standing tall, their chests puffed out because they have their champion, Goliath, standing between them and Israel. With him out there, they're totally secure. They have no care in the world. They are, in their minds, already victorious. On the other side, you have the Israelite army lined up, and all of their tails are between their legs. And the ironic thing here is that for them, the one who is the most qualified and the one who was supposed to be out there, King Saul, is afraid too. And he won't engage in this. He is hiding in the same way that he hid when he was first presented to Israel. Who better to fight this giant than the tallest man in Israel? But yet he won't. Way back in chapter 8, verses 19 and 20, the people of Israel told Saul, they said, "But there shall be a king over us, that we may be like all the nations, that our king may judge us." And here we go. "And go out before us and fight our battles." It's no wonder then that in the coming verses that we're going to see in the next number of weeks, that the Israelites so quickly abandoned Saul and fled to David. Saul was a coward, he was a failure, and he was a letdown of the national hope. So when the Spirit left him, he truly went from hero to zero. So what does that leave us with? The unlikely hero, David. And unlike Saul, David had the Spirit of the Lord upon him, and he's ready to take on this task. From the moment that he steps within an earshot of Goliath, it's plainly obvious that he is God's man. Whereas Saul was more concerned with protecting and saving his own skin and his own reputation, the one thing that David is concerned about is protecting the reputation of God. Whereas he hears Goliath verbally attacking the Lord, it's a personal offense to him. When Goliath threatens David in verse 44, saying, "Hey, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field," David takes it as a threat not to him, but to God in verse 45. "Then David said to the Philistine, 'You come to me with a sword and a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut your head off. And I will give the dead bodies of the hosts of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with the sword and the spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. Them are fighting words, folks. And David ain't backing down. And it's in that which Goliath starts running toward David. David starts running toward him. And can you imagine the tension on both sides of what's going on here? The Israelites have been threatened by Goliath for 40 days. Their very freedom is dependent on what's going to happen in this fight. And as David rushes into the middle of the valley, he reaches into his shepherd's bag. He pulls out his slingshot and a couple of smooth stones. Those stones would have been about 2 to 3 inches in diameter, and a skilled slingshotter, if that's even a word, could sling a stone anywhere between 100 and 150 miles an hour. That's fast, and that's a big stone that's coming out for him. And the only thing I can imagine this tension being close to would be when Marvin Frazier took on Mike Tyson at the Glens Falls Civic Center back in 1986. And perhaps people had anticipated this fight for a long time. Tyson was going to fight the son of the great boxer Joe Frazier. It was pitted to be the fight of the year. I'm sure that there was mega dollars that were put on this fight. And the longer it went, the more entertaining it was. The longer that it went, the more money exchanged hands. The bell rang to start the fight, and the crowd was ready. 6 punches in, and 30 seconds later, Tyson knocked him out cold. Game over. That's it. You pay your tickets, you put your bets down. 30 seconds, the fight's over. And here, you're talking about David and Goliath coming at each other. You think this is going to be the fight of the century, and David just takes out a slingshot. He swings it round and round, just like that song told us when we were kids in Sunday school. He throws it, and it pegs Goliath right between the eyes, the one part that his helmet did not cover. He had to have stumbled a bit because verse 49 says that he fell on his face. So if you got hit this way, you would probably go backwards. You'd probably stumble and then fall over. And in a matter of seconds, David had won. Maybe. He couldn't be so sure. So verse 50 gives us a little bit of a detail that we typically don't tell kids in the Sunday school lessons, right? that Goliath had this huge sword. This is what it says. There was a sword. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword, the Goliath's sword, drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut his head off with it. So if Goliath wasn't dead yet, he is certainly dead now. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, the text says they took off. And immediately, this quickens the faith of the Israelite army. And in verse 52, they can now join the battle. It says that the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout, pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Sha'arim as far as Gath and Ekron, and the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp, and David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, and he put his armor in the tent. Now, funny little detail, Jerusalem was not established until well into David's kingdom. That means that as the Israelites got to plunder all the goods and the silverware and all the stuff that is worth it from the camp, David's plunder was the head of Goliath, and he carried it with him for years. No one said the Bible was pretty, folks. But the point of all this is that Israel had to look to their hero David to do the work on their behalf before they could enjoy the victory. And seeing their enemies flee from them and plundering their camp. And this is precisely why it's a mistake when we look at this passage and apply it by saying, you got to be like David. You got to run after your giants and slay them. It's a mistake because you can't be David. There's only one that can. And just as David had to fight and win the victory on behalf of Israel, the true David, the true King, Jesus, had to fight and win the victory for us. Jesus, through his life and death and resurrection, won the battle. And just like the Israelites, we cannot truly enjoy the benefits of victory unless we first see him win. We are the ones who, without his victory, stand frozen on the sidelines of the battle singing, "I'm holding out for a hero." But friends, we don't need to hold out for a hero to the end of the night, because Jesus is strong, Jesus is fast, Jesus is fresh from the fight. He has won the victory, and we then can taste and enjoy his victory through faith in him. Friends, you don't have to be fearful of the giant problems in your life. They don't have to overwhelm you anymore. They don't have to have power over your time, over your thoughts, over your emotions. You don't have to look to the things of this world in order to win the day. You don't have to worry about misperceiving the reality that you think is true. The true hero, the true David, the King has come. And his name is Jesus. And we see that chiefly now in the last few verses. In verse 55, as soon as Saul saw David go out from the Philistines, he said to Abner and the commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is this youth?" And Abner said, "As your soul lives, O king, I do not know." And the king said, "Inquire whose son this boy is." And as soon as David returned from striking down the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, "Whose son are you, young man?" And David answered, "I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite." Now remember that chapter 17 happens chronologically before the middle of 16. So this is how David is introduced to Saul, but he is introduced on his own merits, for his father Jesse is still back home on the farm. This was a mystery of whose son this was. So when Jesus stepped onto the scene, there was no mystery of who he belonged to. Of course, his earthly adopted father was Joseph. But when it was time for Jesus to enter the battle at the very beginning of his ministry, Jesus was lifted out of the waters of the Jordan River by John the Baptist. And Scripture tells us that the heavens tore open and that the Spirit descended like a dove upon Jesus, thus anointing him for his ministry. And then what do we hear? We don't hear, "Whose son is this?" but rather we hear, "This is my beloved son with whom I am well pleased." And immediately, Matthew tells us, he went into the wilderness to fight Goliath, the serpent, the scaly one, whom he would triumph over. This is our hero. This is the one who secured victory over sin and death, not with a stone and a sling, but with blood, with a blood-stained cross. In him, we no longer have to hold out for a hero. He's here, he's won, and now he calls you to enjoy the spoils of his victory.